Today I will be sharing some tips for how I approach a geologic drawing. Geology is a very observational and visual field. These drawings are useful for helping us interpret a rock or a landscape, and they convey information that a photograph would not necessarily be able to highlight. The subject in this video is a quartz point, which is sample number 4 in your kit. The first thing I do when making a sketch is define the vague overall shape of the subject and its axes, or the directions of the height and width. How I think of this step is if you blurred your eyes or took off your glasses, what would be the shape of the object? Then I define the axes, which will help me determine the relationship between height and width. Notice I'm lining up my pencil with the subject to determine the angles of the axes. When sketching in this step, I'm making very light, short marks with my pencil because these lines will likely not remain in the final drawing. Now I start to break down the shape from the rough form that I drew earlier. In very simple two-dimensional shapes, the quartz point is basically a triangle on top and a prism on the bottom. From here, I start to refine the overall shape and define the different faces of the crystal. At this point, the axes and original sketch marks are starting to get in the way. You can keep them if you'd prefer. You could also stop drawing at this point, and you would have a perfectly good geologic drawing that shows your subject and the different crystal faces. However, we can also push the boundaries and introduce shading. As with earlier steps, I'm breaking down the shadows and highlights by defining their shapes. I tend to fill them in as I go, but you could outline the shadows first and fill them in later. I start with lighter tones first and work my way towards darker tones because it's easier to make a shadow darker, but more difficult to lighten them. This is the part of drawing that takes the most time, but helps to define your object the most. Here I'm placing the quartz on a white sheet of paper so I can better see how the shadows are cast. If you're working with a subject you can move around, this is nice to do because you can trace the shape of the shadows on your piece of paper. Here I have light coming from different directions, which is why there are many shadows. Like the highlights and lowlights within the subject, the shadows it casts are not a flat tone, but instead they have a gradient. Here is the finished product, and for comparison, the original subject from roughly the angle I was working with. Notice how the photograph has a hard time showing the different faces of the quartz point, which is something easily depicted in the drawing, even if you didn't include any shading. There are definitely some things I could change or would do differently next time, but hopefully this walkthrough of my methods might help you get more comfortable with sketching.